Winter announced itself early that year. In November of 1887, in the northern reaches of Minnesota Territory, the ground froze before the last leaves had finished falling. The Menominee Ridge sat quiet beneath a thin skin of snow, its forests stiff and brittle, its hills already locked into the long wait for deeper cold. Smoke rose from scattered homesteads along the valley floor, thick and constant, the sign of families burning more wood than they wanted to admit. On the slope above them, Eliza Warren stood alone with a shovel planted in the frozen soil. She was 34 years old, a widow for nearly 3 winters. Not poor enough to beg, not wealthy enough to fail safely. She wore a wool coat that had been mended twice at the elbows, a scarf pulled high over her chin, and gloves so stiff with dried clay they barely bent. Her breath came out in short white bursts as she looked up the hillside she had chosen. It was not flat ground. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Most cabins in the territory followed a simple rule: build where the land is easy, not where it resists you. Flat ground meant fewer days cutting, fewer logs dragged uphill, fewer chances of collapse. Men who ignored that rule tended to get remembered briefly and then forgotten. Eliza was doing more than ignoring it. She had marked the slope with wooden stakes, 5 horizontal lines climbing the hill like uneven steps. Each line sat higher than the last, carved into the earth just deep enough to suggest intention. To anyone passing below, it looked less like a foundation and more like a mistake repeated several times. That morning, her nearest neighbor, Thomas Klein, rode up the trail with his mule and stopped to stare. He didn't call out at first. He just watched her dig. Eliza drove the shovel into the clay, leaned her weight into it, and pried up a slab of frozen soil. She lifted it, carried it forward, and dumped it onto a growing pile that would later become a retaining edge. Then she went back for another. After several minutes, Klein finally spoke. "You planning to terrace a vineyard up there?" he asked. Eliza didn't turn. She didn't stop working. "I'm building a house." Klein laughed once, sharp and surprised. "A house?" He gestured with his glove. "You're halfway up a hill. That's not a house. That's erosion with ambition." She planted the shovel again. "It's where the ground holds." "The ground holds everywhere," he said. "That's why we build on it, not into it." Eliza straightened slowly and faced him. Her face was thin, weathered by years of wind and grief. Her eyes were steady. "I'm not building 1 room," she said. "I'm building 5. Klein blinked. 5. Stacked. He looked at the stakes again, this time more carefully. The realization spread across his face, followed by disbelief. "You're going to stack rooms?" he said. "Like stairs?" "Yes." He leaned back in the saddle and laughed louder now, the sound carrying down the slope. "You know what happens to heat, don't you?" Eliza met his eyes. "It rises." "That's right," he said. "And you know what happens to earth walls?" "They stay." Klein shook his head. "You're going to freeze. Or bury yourself. Or both. Winter's already early. You don't have time for this kind of foolishness." Eliza nodded once, as if acknowledging a weather report. "I don't have time not to." That afternoon, word spread. By evening, 2 more men stopped by. By the end of the week, nearly everyone within 3 miles had seen the stakes and heard the explanation. And nearly everyone had an opinion. Some were kind about it. "You should remarry," one woman told her gently. "This is too much work alone." Others were less so. "You think you're smarter than everyone who's ever built a cabin?" an older trapper asked. "Coal doesn't care about clever." One man offered to sell her extra firewood in advance, before your tunnel collapses. Eliza listened. She thanked them. She went back to digging. What they did not see, what none of them stood still long enough to notice, was the notebook tucked into her coat pocket. Pages already creased and smudged. Measurements. Sketches. Small numbers written carefully in the margins. Eliza had not come to this idea suddenly. 3 winters earlier, her husband Caleb Warren had frozen to death less than a mile from their cabin. He had gone out at dawn to check a fence line after a night of heavy wind. The fire had been strong when he left. The cabin warm enough to steam damp wool. He told her he'd be back in an hour. He was found at dusk. Hypothermia, the doctor said later, as if naming it changed anything. Exposure. A simple failure of heat. That winter, Eliza learned something she would never forget. Cold did not kill with drama. It killed with arithmetic. Their cabin had 4 walls and a roof, all of them bleeding warmth into the air. They burned through it faster than Caleb could cut it. Heat rose to the ceiling and stayed there, useless, while the floor iced over. They slept in layers and still woke shivering. The fire never stopped, but it never won. After Caleb's death, Eliza stayed. She stayed through 2 more winters. She repaired the cabin. She rationed wood. She measured how fast water froze on different shelves. She noticed where frost formed first, where it lingered longest. She watched how smoke climbed straight up the chimney and never touched the corners of the room. She did not speak much about what she was learning. By the time she sold the old cabin and moved her supplies uphill, she was certain of only one thing. Building the same way again would not save her. The slope she chose faced south, catching what little winter sun the sky would offer. The soil beneath the first foot was dense clay, packed and stubborn. Below that, it stayed dry even after rain. She tested drainage with buckets of water. She waited. She measured. When the ground froze, she kept digging anyway. Each level took days. The work was slow and punishing. Her hands cracked and bled. The shovel rang against stone more often than she liked. At night, she slept in a temporary shelter near the base of the hill, wrapped in blankets, listening to the wind crawl over the ridge. Neighbors stopped coming as often. The novelty faded. The laughter settled into certainty. "She'll quit by December," Klein said at the Trading Post. "She'll come begging for space by January," another added. No one noticed that Eliza never asked for firewood. By the first week of December, the lowest terrace was finished. A flat platform cut cleanly into the hill, its rear wall solid earth, its front edge braced with stone. She stood there at dusk, looking up at the remaining stakes climbing into the snow. 5 levels. Each one 8 feet higher than the last. She could already picture the rooms. The lowest cool and steady. The middle spaces warmer. The top chamber holding. She could also picture the winter coming. The old men at the post were right about one thing. This winter would not forgive mistakes. The first deep freeze arrived before Christmas. The creek below locked into silence. Trees cracked at night like distant gunfire. Cabins along the valley began burning wood day and night, smoke hanging low and heavy. Eliza dug anyway. On the night of December 22nd, the temperature dropped below 0 and did not rise again. From the valley, the hillside looked wrong. There was no finished house. No tall chimney. Just a woman, a slope, and a strange set of steps carved into frozen earth. And everyone watching was certain of the same thing. She would not survive what was coming. By the time January arrived, winter had taken its full seat. The snow along Menominee Ridge deepened from a cover into a weight. Paths disappeared. Fence posts leaned like tired men. The creek below Eliza Warren's hillside stopped moving altogether, its surface sealed under thick ice that groaned softly at night as temperatures dropped further. This was the season that revealed mistakes. In the valley, cabins that had felt sturdy in October now showed their weaknesses. Smoke poured constantly from chimneys, a sign not of comfort, but of desperation. Firewood piles shrank faster than anyone had planned. Men cut trees they had meant to save. Women mended gloves while standing close enough to fires that sparks burned holes through wool. Eliza watched all of it from above. She had finished carving 3 levels into the hill by the first week of January. They were not enclosed yet. Just step terraces backed by raw earth, edged with stone and timber she had hauled herself. Snow gathered on the unfinished floors. Ice formed along the shaded sides. At night, she still slept in her temporary shelter, a low structure of canvas and boards near the base of the slope. It was barely adequate. She kept a small fire going and woke often to feed it. The cold found its way in through every seam. She knew what people were saying. At the Trading Post, her name had become shorthand. "She's still digging," someone would say. As if that explained everything. She should have stopped weeks ago. She's going to lose the land. She's stubborn enough to die up there. Eliza did not defend herself. She had learned that explanations invited argument, and argument wasted energy she needed for work. Instead, she measured. Each morning, she checked the frost line in the earth walls. She pressed her bare palm to the clay and noted how quickly it stole heat from her skin. She recorded how deep the cold penetrated overnight, how long it took for the soil to soften again during daylight. The earth did not behave like air. It changed slowly. She remembered. That mattered. Her supplies were limited. That was the risk everyone saw, and they were not wrong. She had enough food for one winter if she rationed carefully. Enough firewood for a single small stove, not for a traditional cabin that would need constant feeding. If her idea failed, there would be no recovery. This was not a project she could abandon halfway. On January 10th, Thomas Klein rode up again, this time without laughter. He dismounted near the lowest terrace and stamped his feet against the cold. His beard was rimmed with ice. He looked thinner than he had in the fall. "You still working?" he said. Eliza nodded and kept stacking stones along the front edge of the second level. She had begun laying the foundation for the first enclosed room. Flat stones, carefully chosen, fitted together with minimal gaps. She worked methodically, as if each piece had been waiting for its place. Klein watched in silence for a moment. "You know, my wife's been sick," he said finally. "The cold aggravates her lungs." Eliza glanced at him, then back to the stones. "Our cabin can't hold heat anymore," he continued. "No matter how much we burn. It slips out through the floor, the walls. Feels like trying to warm a sieve." She said nothing. "You don't have to prove anything," Klein said. "If you want help, we could build you a proper cabin before February gets worse." Eliza set a stone and straightened. Her face was calm, but there was steel under it. "I don't need help building something I already know won't work." He frowned. "And this will." She hesitated just long enough for the truth to matter. "I don't know," she said. "But I know what failed before." Klein looked past her, up the hill. The unfinished terraces, the raw earth walls. The strange geometry of it all. "If this goes wrong," he said quietly, "there won't be time." "I'm aware." He stayed a few minutes longer, then left without another word. The cold deepened. By late January, the temperature dropped below -10 and stayed there. The valley grew quieter. People went out less. When they did, they moved quickly, heads down, faces wrapped tight. Eliza finished enclosing the first level at the end of the month. It was small, 12 feet wide, 14 feet deep. The rear wall was pure earth, smoothed and left exposed. The side walls were half log, half hillside. Only the front wall faced open air, built thick and tight, with a single heavy door. She installed the stove there at the lowest point, where the hill began. She did not light it yet. Above that room, she built the second, then the third, each one stepping back into the hill, each one with less exposure to the wind and more contact with the earth. She worked from the bottom up, knowing the foundation would determine everything. Her hands were raw. Her shoulders ached constantly. There were mornings she woke with her jaw clenched so tight it hurt to open her mouth. But the work itself was steady. By the time February arrived, she had enclosed all 5 levels. From the front, the structure looked like a series of stacked rooms receding into the hill, each one slightly smaller than the last. The topmost chamber was almost entirely buried, with only a small south-facing window and a vent cut near the ceiling. It looked nothing like a normal house. It looked intentional. The ridicule faded into something quieter. Concern. "You can still move down," someone told her at the post. "Plenty of cabins looking for help." She shook her head. She moved her supplies inside instead. She placed food in the lowest room, where the temperature stayed coolest. Tools and extra clothing went higher. The top chamber, she left empty except for a simple sleeping platform built near the ceiling, where heat would gather. On February 6th, she lit the stove. At first, nothing dramatic happened. The lowest room warmed quickly, as any room near a fire would. The second level followed slowly. The third barely changed. The fourth and fifth stayed cold. In some cabins, fires burned until there was nothing left to feed them. In one, a family abandoned their home entirely and walked 10 miles through the storm to reach shelter. On the hillside above them, Eliza Warren slept in the top chamber of her unfinished-looking house. She woke before dawn and noticed something odd. She was warm. Not the strained, fragile warmth of a fire-fed room that demanded attention every hour. This was different. Even. Quiet. She sat up and breathed. The air did not sting her lungs. She climbed down through the rooms, bare feet touching stone and wood. With each level, the air cooled slightly, but it never turned harsh. The lowest room, near the stove, was warm enough to work in without gloves. She checked the thermometer she had hung near the doorway. Then she checked it again. The numbers made sense. The winter outside had finally done what she needed it to do. It had turned the hill into a shell of cold around a core of steady earth. Eliza stood there for a long time, listening to the wind howl over the ridge, feeling the quiet stability of the rooms around her. For the first time since Caleb died, she allowed herself a thought she had not spoken aloud. She might live through this winter after all. Eliza Warren did not explain her house. She let it explain itself. By mid-February, the worst of the blizzards had passed, but the cold settled deeper, more deliberate. The kind that crept into bones and refused to leave. The valley cabins showed it. Smoke never stopped rising. Men split wood with numb hands. Children slept in layers and still woke crying. From below, Eliza's structure looked unchanged. No grand reveal. No sudden transformation. Just the same stepped face cut into the hill, snow gathered along its edges, smoke rising thin and steady from a single narrow pipe. That quietness was part of the design. Inside, Eliza worked methodically. She adjusted nothing quickly. Every change was deliberate, measured, reversible. She believed in systems that revealed themselves slowly, without force. The first thing she refined was the path heat took. Heat did not spread like light. It did not fill a space evenly just because a fire existed. It moved with rules. Eliza had learned those rules the hard way, watching warmth pool uselessly near ceilings while her feet went numb. So she gave heat a reason to move. Between each level, she had left a vertical opening near the rear wall. Not large. Just wide enough for air to rise without racing. The openings aligned from the lowest room to the highest, forming a continuous shaft hidden behind timber framing and clay. It was not a chimney. Smoke followed a different path entirely. This was for warm air alone. At first, she had worried she'd misjudged the size. Too large and the warmth would rush upward, leaving the lower levels cold. Too small and heat would stagnate, trapped where it began. She tested it the way she tested everything else. By holding her palm near the opening. By watching how long a candle flame leaned before steadying. By listening. Air had a sound when it moved properly. A soft, patient pull. She adjusted the openings with boards and clay until the movement felt right. She lined the earth walls with a thin layer of hardened clay, not to seal them, but to stop dust from shedding. She did not insulate them. Insulation would defeat the purpose. She wanted the hill itself to participate. The earth was not an enemy here. It was a reservoir. Each day, the walls absorbed excess warmth. Each night, they returned it slowly, smoothing the extremes that killed people in poorly built cabins. The floors mattered too. In the lower rooms, she laid stone directly onto packed earth, no air gap. The stone stayed cool, steady, unchanging. In the upper levels, where warmth gathered, she raised wooden platforms for walking and sleeping, lifting her body into the warmer layer of air. Nothing was decorative. Everything served a reason. On February 19th, Thomas Klein returned. This time he brought no mule. He walked. The trail up the hill was narrow and packed hard by weeks of wind. Klein climbed carefully, stopping once to catch his breath. He knocked on the lowest door with a gloved hand, unsure of what he would find. Eliza opened it without surprise. The air that met him was cool, but not biting. It felt like a cellar in early fall, not a winter room. He stepped inside and removed his hat. "Where's the fire?" he asked. Eliza pointed with her chin. The stove sat against the rear wall, burning low. A small, steady flame. Nothing like the roaring furnaces he'd seen elsewhere. "That's it?" he asked. "That's it." He looked around. The walls. The floor. The lack of frost. How much wood? 4 logs yesterday. Klein swallowed. He had burned nearly 20 in the same span. She led him upward. The second level was warmer. Not by much. Just enough to feel it. The third was warmer still. Comfortable. The fourth felt like late spring. By the time they reached the fifth, Klein was unbuttoning his coat. The top room glowed softly, lit by a small oil lamp. Snow pressed against the buried walls outside, but inside, the air was dry and calm. Klein stood still for a long moment. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "It does," Eliza replied. "It just doesn't match what we're used to." He looked at the ceiling, the vent near the top, the way warmth gathered above them without feeling trapped. "You stack them," he said slowly, "so the heat climbs." "Yes." "And the hill keeps it from leaving." "Yes." "And you're not trying to fight the cold outside." "No." He nodded once, as if accepting a difficult truth. "You let winter finish the work." She smiled faintly. After Klein left, word spread differently. Not with laughter. With hesitation. Men began stopping at the base of the hill, standing longer than before. They asked fewer questions and made fewer jokes. Some asked if they could step inside. Eliza allowed it. She did not lecture. She answered only what was asked. Why into the hill? Because the earth didn't swing wildly in temperature. Why stack? Because heat rose whether you respected it or not. Why one fire? Because 5 were wasteful. Someone asked if it was dangerous. Only if you pretend heat behaves differently than it does, she said. The skepticism did not vanish overnight. One man insisted the structure would rot. Another claimed it would collapse after spring thaw. A third warned that moisture would kill her in her sleep. Eliza listened. She had prepared for moisture. The vents near the top allowed damp air to escape slowly without pulling warmth with it. The clay lining resisted condensation. Snow piled against the outer walls acted as insulation, not threat. She had prepared for weight. The hill pressed gently, evenly, not sharply. The stone foundations at each front wall resisted the slow push of earth behind them. She had prepared for rot. Wood never touched wet soil without protection. Every joint was sealed with care. Preparation did not guarantee success, but it made success possible. By late February, the numbers spoke louder than opinions. Outside temperatures dipped below -20 for days at a time. Inside, Eliza's thermometer showed a consistent pattern. Lowest room, just above 50. Second, low 60s. She recorded it without flourish. She knew better than to celebrate early. The hill had become what she hoped it would. A layered system. A gradient. A quiet machine built of earth, wood, and patience. She did not call it innovation. She called it survival. At night, lying on the raised platform in the top room, Eliza listened to the wind scour the ridge. She thought of Caleb, of the way cold had taken him without cruelty or malice. Just numbers. This time, the numbers were on her side. And winter, for the first time in years, felt contained. The true test did not arrive with noise. It arrived with silence. In early March of 1887, the wind stopped moving across Menominee Ridge. The sky flattened into a hard, pale sheet. Snow that had once drifted now lay frozen in place, sculpted into sharp ridges by weeks of cold. The temperature dropped steadily, hour by hour, until numbers no longer mattered as much as sensation. -20 became -30. Then it stayed there. This was the cold that broke habits. The cold that punished assumptions. The cold that turned small flaws into fatal ones. In the valley, cabins changed character. Smoke thickened, not because fires burned hotter, but because green wood had begun to replace dry. Men cut whatever they could reach. Old fence rails. Broken furniture. Crates that once held supplies. Anything that would burn, even poorly, even briefly. Inside those cabins, the air grew damp. Moisture from breath and boiling pots condensed on walls that could not hold heat. Frost crept inward from corners. Doors warped. Chinking cracked. Cold found every weakness and made a home there. Children stopped being sent to sleep alone. Women stayed awake through the night, feeding fires, counting logs, calculating whether there would be enough to last until morning. There were mornings when families woke to ice on the inside of their windows. There were nights when the fire went out because no one had the strength left to keep it alive. On the hillside above them, Eliza Warren marked the calendar with a charcoal line and checked her thermometer. She had expected this. She had built for this. The earth surrounding her rooms had finally frozen near the surface. Snow had piled thick against the buried walls, sealing them under a blanket of trapped air. The hill had transformed into exactly what she needed it to be, a cold shell around a warm core. Inside her structure, the gradient sharpened. The lower rooms remained steady, their temperatures barely shifting despite the increasing cold outside. The middle levels grew warmer as heat continued to rise and settle. The top chamber, where she slept, reached temperatures that made blankets unnecessary. Eliza did not touch the stove more than twice a day. She did not feed it aggressively. She let it burn low and steady, respecting the system rather than forcing it. Each log she added felt deliberate, not desperate. On March 5th, Thomas Klein's wife collapsed. The cold had worsened her breathing all winter. That morning, she could not rise from bed. Klein wrapped her in every blanket they owned, but the cabin refused to hold warmth. The fire burned hot enough to crack stones, but the air near the floor stayed bitter. By afternoon, he made the decision he had been avoiding for weeks. He loaded his wife onto a sled and began the slow climb toward Eliza's hillside. He did not announce himself. He knocked once and leaned against the doorframe while Eliza pulled it open. She took one look at his wife's gray face and stepped aside without a word. They did not talk much that night. Eliza guided them upward, level by level, until they reached the fourth chamber. She laid Klein's wife on the raised platform near the wall, wrapped her in dry blankets, and placed a cup of warm broth in her hands. Within minutes, the woman's breathing eased. Within an hour, the color returned to her cheeks. Klein sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and stared at the thermometer hanging nearby. He watched the needle stay still. "Nothing's changing," he said. "That's the point," Eliza replied. Word traveled fast when fear was involved. By the next day, 2 more families arrived at the base of the hill. One had burned through nearly all their firewood. Another had lost a child to frostbite the night before, despite never leaving their cabin. Eliza did not turn anyone away. She rearranged space. She moved supplies higher or lower as needed. She opened her home the way one opens a door in a storm, without ceremony, because there is no other decent choice. The structure absorbed the pressure. It did not grow colder. It did not fail. The rooms filled with quiet movement. People sleeping, eating, breathing without pain. Children removing mittens indoors for the first time in weeks. Outside, the cold continued its work. A cabin 2 miles down the valley collapsed under the weight of snow and neglect. Its owner was found inside days later, frozen beside an empty hearth. Another family abandoned their home in the night and disappeared into the forest. No one saw them again. The winter did not care about good intentions. It cared about design. Eliza kept records even as her house filled with people. She noted how the additional body heat affected the gradient. How long it took the earth walls to absorb and redistribute the warmth. How the upper levels warmed slightly more with increased occupancy, while the lower rooms remained stable. The system adjusted. It always adjusted. On March 9th, Otto Zimmermann arrived. He was a builder by reputation, a man whose cabins were known for tight joints and careful work. If anyone had reason to doubt Eliza's structure, it was him. He walked through the rooms slowly, touching walls, tapping stone with his knuckles, standing still in each level long enough to feel the difference. "This isn't luck," he said finally. "No," Eliza agreed. "You didn't just stack rooms," he continued. "You stacked behavior." She watched him understand. "The heat moves where you want it," he said, "because you gave it nowhere else to go. And the earth keeps it from leaving," she added. Zimmermann nodded. "We've been fighting winter like it's an enemy. You treated it like a condition." That night he stayed. He slept in the 3rd level, wrapped in a single blanket, his boots drying by the warmth that rose naturally through the structure. Outside, the temperature fell again. -32. The cold reached into the valley with renewed cruelty. Firewood piles finally ran out. Men began dismantling sheds and barns, burning wood meant to last generations. Some didn't have that option. 3 days later, the trading post closed. The man who ran it sealed the doors and left, abandoning supplies he could not protect. The valley emptied. Those who remained gathered on the hillside. Eliza's structure became something no one had planned. A refuge. Not because it was large, but because it worked. She watched people who had mocked her weeks earlier sit silently on her stone floors, hands spread toward warmth that did not demand payment in fuel or exhaustion. No one laughed anymore. No one argued. The winter had stripped opinion down to outcome. On the morning of March 14th, Eliza woke before dawn and climbed to the highest level. She stood near the small window and watched the horizon lighten. The thermometer read 87. Below her, people slept. Below them, the earth held steady. And outside, the cold continued its assault on structures that had never been built to withstand it. The test was no longer theoretical. It was happening hour by hour. And one hillside house, carved against tradition and ridicule, was standing quietly in the middle of it. By the 3rd week of March, the argument was over. Not because anyone admitted they were wrong, but because the numbers stopped being deniable. The cold did not loosen its grip. If anything, it hardened. The nights remained below -30. The days barely climbed above -20. Snow no longer fell often, but what lay on the ground stayed frozen, compacted into a crust that reflected light like glass. And still, smoke rose from Eliza Warren's hillside in a thin, unhurried line. It was not the desperate column seen in the valley, thick with green wood and panic. It was steady, narrow, controlled. That alone drew attention. Otto Zimmermann was the first to put figures to what everyone was feeling. He brought his own thermometer and checked it himself, twice a day for 3 days straight. He stood in each level for long minutes, notebook in hand, waiting for readings to stabilize before writing anything down. He did not trust impressions. He trusted consistency. Lowest room, near the stove, 54 degrees. Second level, 66. Third, 78. Fourth, 90. Fifth, near the ceiling, just under 100. Each level rose by roughly 12 degrees. Every day. Zimmermann recalculated twice, scratching numbers out and writing them again. The gradient did not weaken at night. It did not collapse when the fire burned low. It held even when Eliza skipped a feeding entirely. "How much wood?" he asked finally. Eliza showed him the stack. It was smaller than most men burned in a week. She had been using 4, sometimes 5 logs per day. Zimmermann closed his notebook slowly. "My cabin eats 20, he said. And it's half this size." That was the moment the structure stopped being a curiosity and became a problem. Because if Eliza's house worked, then everyone else's had failed. Men who had spent decades building the same way began arriving not to look, but to measure. They brought rulers, thermometers. They pressed palms to walls. They knelt to feel floors. They checked vents and openings, trying to find the trick. There was no trick, only obedience to how heat actually behaved. The consequences unfolded quickly. Bruno Haskett, who had mocked Eliza openly in January, arrived one afternoon pale and shaking. His firewood was gone. His cabin had become unlivable. He stood at the base of the hill, pride visibly eroding. "I don't need to stay," he said. "I just need to warm my hands." Eliza stepped aside and let him in. He did not leave that night. Others followed. A trapper who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite. A family who had been burning their own furniture. An older couple who had tried to walk out and turned back when the cold stole their strength. Eliza did not keep count. She only adjusted. More people meant more body heat. The system absorbed it easily. The upper levels grew warmer. The lower levels remained stable. When heat built too much at the top, she opened the vent briefly, bleeding excess warmth without disturbing the gradient below. Zimmermann watched this carefully. "You're not trapping heat," he said. "You're managing it." "Yes," Eliza replied. "Trapping would make it dangerous." Within days, word spread beyond the ridge. Men from 5 miles away arrived. Some walked. Some dragged sleds with whatever possessions they could carry. They did not come with arguments. They came with fear and exhaustion. And every one of them noticed the same thing. There was no rush inside the structure. No frantic stoking of fires. No shouting. No coughing from damp air. No ice forming on walls. The house did not feel alive. It felt settled. Zimmerman made his decision on March 21st. He asked Eliza to walk him through the structure again, slowly, from bottom to top. He stopped at each transition, each place where log met earth, where warm air shifted direction. At the top level, he stood near the sleeping platform and exhaled slowly. "We've been building for speed," he said. "Not for survival." Eliza did not argue. "We learned to build fast because fast meant alive in the short term," he continued. "But fast bleeds heat." That afternoon, Zimmerman announced he would build one. Not a copy. An adaptation. 3 levels instead of 5. Smaller chambers. South-facing slope. Same principles. Other word spread the way useful knowledge always does. Quietly. No announcements. No plans nailed to doors. Men talked while splitting wood. Women compared notes while mending clothes. Someone would mention a house that stayed warm without effort. Someone else would say they'd seen it. By autumn, 7 hillside shelters stood within a day's ride. None of them were identical. Some used more stone. Some used thicker logs. One man built his channels slightly narrower and corrected it later. Another learned the hard way that a north-facing slope did not forgive poor solar gain. Mistakes happened. But no one froze. The winter of 1888 arrived with less cruelty than the year before, but it still tested what had been built. The new structures performed as expected. Cabins in the valley burned less wood. Fewer nights were spent feeding fires until dawn. Children slept without hats indoors. Eliza did not leave her hillside. She repaired where needed. She adjusted vents. She replaced worn chinking in places where freeze and thaw had done their quiet work. She wrote less in her notebook now, but she still wrote. She wrote temperatures. She wrote observations. She wrote the kind of notes meant for someone else. In October, a man from 2 counties north arrived on horseback, having heard about the woman with the stacked house. He brought questions and left with measurements scratched onto scrap paper. He built his version the following summer. Others followed. By the early 1890s, hillside shelters had become a recognized solution in northern territories where wood was scarce and winters were unforgiving. They were not common everywhere. Flat land still tempted builders with speed and convenience. But where winter mattered more than tradition, people chose differently. Eliza did not profit from it. She never charged. She never claimed ownership of the idea. When asked why she shared so freely, she answered simply, "I buried a man who trusted the old way." That was explanation enough. She grew older on the hillside. Her hair went gray. Her hands stiffened in the mornings. She moved more slowly between levels, pausing on steps she had once climbed without thought. The structure adapted with her. Lower rooms became living spaces. The highest chamber became storage. The gradient still worked. It always did. Eliza died quietly in 1912, during a winter that was harsh but manageable. She was found in the 3rd level, where the air stayed steady and the light was softest. There were no signs of struggle. No fire burned too low. No cold had crept in unnoticed. She was buried on the ridge, above the structure she had carved from earth and stubbornness. The hillside house did not disappear. A farming family occupied it for years. Then another. During a particularly bad winter in 1936, it sheltered 3 households at once. In later decades, it became storage, then shelter again, then nearly forgotten as modern heating spread across the region. But it never failed. Modern builders who visited it remarked on the same things. The silence. The steadiness. The way the temperatures seemed indifferent to the weather outside. Historians would later note that Eliza Warren had not invented anything new. Thermal mass existed long before her. Convection had always behaved as it did. Earth had always held its temperature patiently beneath the surface. What she changed was attention. She watched instead of assuming. She measured instead of arguing. She built for how the world actually worked, not how people expected it to behave. In a time when survival often depended on speed and conformity, she chose precision and restraint. She accepted mockery rather than comfort. She trusted math when tradition failed her. And Winter, faced with a structure that did not fight it, finally lost its leverage. The hillside still stands. Grass grows over its roof in summer. Snow piles thick against its walls in winter. Inside, the air remains calm, layered, predictable. A quiet reminder carved into earth that survival is rarely loud, that intelligence does not announce itself, and that the most powerful solutions often come not from force, but from understanding.